Welcome back, everyone. Today's deep dive is going to be really interesting, I think. We're going to be looking at culture.
Okay.
It's something that we all kind of experience all the time,
Mm-hmm.
but we don't always stop and think about it. And you, our listener, have sent in some excerpts from a sociology textbook because you want to understand culture better, like what it is, how it works, and why it matters.
Right.
So we're going to try to unpack some of that today.
Yeah.
One of the interesting things I read in this book is how even simple greetings can be misinterpreted across cultures. Like, you know how we always say, how are you? It's
Right.
like just a casual pleasantry.
Yeah.
But in some cultures, like a really detailed response to how are you is expected.
Yeah.
It's not just like, oh, I'm fine, how are you? It's like, actually,
Yeah.
like you got to really give the full rundown.
Yeah, and it throws you off if you're not expecting it.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
And it can lead to some awkwardness.
It really can.
Yeah. So we're going to be covering all sorts of things today, from those little everyday interactions like greetings to bigger concepts like cultural universals, subcultures, and how culture changes.
Yeah.
So to kick things off, let's start with the basics. How do we even define culture? The text makes a distinction between culture and society. What's the difference there?
Right. So it is a little tricky because they're really intertwined.
Right.
But think about it like this. A society is a group of people, right?
Okay.
They interact. They share a territory. Culture, on the other hand, is that glue that holds that society together.
Okay.
It's the shared values and beliefs, behaviors, the language they use, symbols, and even the physical objects they create and use. You can't have one without the other, right?
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
So is it like society is the group of people and culture is their operating system?
That's a good way to put it, yeah. It's like the invisible script that guides how they interact, what they value, how they see the world.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, the book also mentions sociologist Pierre Bourdieu.
Right.
And this idea of cultural capital. What's that all about?
Well, Bourdieu argues that culture isn't just about those shared values
Yeah.
and those practices we talked about. It's also a form of capital,
Oh, wow.
a resource that can be accumulated and used to gain advantages in society.
Okay.
So you kind of categorize it into three forms:
Yeah.
embodied, objectified, and institutionalized.
Okay.
So embodied capital refers to the knowledge, skills, and the dispositions we acquire through socialization.
Right.
So just growing up, learning.
Gotcha.
Then you have objectified capital, and that includes material goods that reflect cultural knowledge and taste. And then finally, institutionalized capital is the recognition received from institutions like degrees.
Okay.
So think about it like someone who grew up going to the opera, right,
Mm-hmm.
might have a very different form of cultural capital than someone whose family mainly watched reality TV.
Right.
And that translates into real advantages later in life.
Okay, so the book also talks about this difference between material and non-material culture. Can you break that down a little bit?
Sure. So material culture, think of it as the tangible things, the
Uh-huh.
objects. Clothing, tools, art, the buildings.
Yeah.
Non-material culture, on the other hand, is all the intangible stuff. So the ideas, beliefs, the values, norms, symbols.
Okay. So if I'm thinking like a Metro Pass, that would be material culture.
Right.
But the entire system of capitalism that it represents is non-material culture.
Exactly. And a lot of times, those two things are really interwoven. Like take clothing, for example, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, a T-shirt is a T-shirt. It's a material object.
Right.
But depending on the design, on the logo, it can convey messages about social status or group affiliations,
Yeah.
even political beliefs.
Boy.
So it's really interesting how these things are connected.
Yeah, that is interesting. It makes you realize how much meaning we attach to everyday objects. Like even a simple T-shirt can be loaded with all these different interpretations.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about how culture can be really diverse, really complex, but are there any common threads that run through all societies? The text mentions this concept of cultural universals. What are those?
Right. So cultural universals, those are patterns or traits that are common to all societies.
Okay.
No matter where you go, what time period you look at,
Yeah.
what the specific practices are. So one example is family units.
Okay.
Every culture has some form of family structure.
Even though they look different
Yes.
in
Yeah,
different parts of the world.
exactly. And the book gives some other really fascinating examples. For example, did you know that the anthropologist George Murdoch actually identified humor as a cultural universal?
Really? I wouldn't have thought of that.
Yeah.
Because of what people find funny
Yeah.
is so different, right?
It is. It is. But think about it. Humor is a way to release tension,
Right.
to kind of build social bonds.
Mm-hmm.
It can even challenge social norms in some ways.
Yeah.
So what people find funny can vary.
Right.
But the act of laughing together, that seems to be pretty universal.
That's really cool. And speaking of differences, the book also talks about ethnocentrism and cultural relativism.
Right.
So how do those concepts play into our understanding of culture?
Okay. So ethnocentrism, that's the tendency to judge other cultures based on the standards of your own culture.
Okay.
It's like looking at the world through this really narrow lens and assuming that your way of doing things is the right way or the best way.
Okay.
So, you could imagine someone from a culture where eating meat is really common
Right.
might be totally horrified by a culture that practices vegetarianism.
Yeah, right.
They might think that's really strange or even wrong without understanding the historical, ecological, or even religious reasons behind that dietary choice.
Right. It's all about perspective, isn't it?
Exactly.
Now, what about cultural relativism?
Okay. So cultural relativism is kind of the opposite of that.
Okay.
It's about trying to understand other cultures on their own terms
Right.
without imposing your own values or judgments.
So instead of saying, that's weird, you try to understand why that practice or
Yes.
that belief makes sense within that particular cultural context.
Exactly. It's about acknowledging that different cultures have different values and beliefs and practices, and none of them are inherently better
Right.
or worse than any other.
Gotcha. So it sounds like cultural relativism is really key to avoiding misunderstandings
It is,
and
yes.
appreciating the diversity of human experience.
Absolutely. It's really about embracing the idea that there are many different ways of being human, and each one has its own unique strengths and perspectives.
Right. The book also touches on this concept of cultural imperialism. What exactly is that?
So cultural imperialism, that's when one culture's beliefs or practices are kind of imposed on another culture.
Okay.
Usually happens through economic or political power. So it often involves suppressing local traditions and then promoting these foreign cultural products.
Mm-hmm.
And that can lead to a loss of cultural diversity and autonomy.
Yeah, it makes me think of how certain Western fashion trends or music genres have spread globally, sometimes at the expense of more traditional cultural expressions.
Exactly. So cultural imperialism is a really complex issue. And there's a lot of debate about the balance between cultural exchange and preserving those unique cultural identities.
Right.
It's important to be aware of.
It's a reminder that culture is not just this abstract concept. It's deeply intertwined with power dynamics, with global flows of information and influence.
Exactly. Understanding those dynamics is really crucial for navigating our world, which is becoming increasingly interconnected.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've defined culture, we've explored cultural universals, and touched on the challenges of ethnocentrism and cultural imperialism. But cultures aren't static, are they? The text discusses how culture changes over time.
Yeah, and that's really important to remember. Culture is constantly evolving. It's influenced by things like internal factors,
Okay.
Innovation, shifting values,
Right.
as well as external forces like globalization and technological advancements.
Right. So what are some of the major drivers of these changes?
Well, one of the biggest drivers is innovation, right?
Mhm.
The discovery of new knowledge or invention of new technologies. Just think about the invention of the printing press
Right.
or the internet.
Mm-hmm.
But those things revolutionized how information is produced, how it's spread, how it's consumed,
Totally.
and led to huge cultural shifts.
And these innovations, they don't just impact one culture, they kind of spread across societies through a process called diffusion, right?
Exactly. So diffusion is that process by which those cultural elements, whether it's ideas, practices, technologies, spread from one society to another.
Okay.
So sometimes it's through direct contact between cultures, sometimes it's trade, migration, or even media.
Right. Now, the book also mentions this idea of cultural lag.
Right.
What is that exactly?
So cultural lag happens when the material culture, like technology, changes faster than the non-material culture. So the values, the beliefs, and the norms. That creates this gap between the way things are done and the way people think they should be done.
So, for example, the rapid development of artificial intelligence is raising all these ethical and social questions
Exactly.
that our existing values and our legal frameworks aren't quite equipped to address yet.
Right. It takes time for societies to adapt to those really rapid changes, to adjust their values and norms to align with that new reality.
Right.
And sometimes that lag can lead to tensions and conflicts as people try to figure out what it all means.
It makes you realize that culture is not just this fixed set of rules. It's this dynamic process of adaptation and negotiation.
That's a great way to put it. Culture is always responding to new challenges, integrating new ideas, and finding ways to make sense of the world around us as it changes.
Okay, so we've explored how culture is defined, how it changes, and some of the complexities of cultural diversity. Now, I want to kind of dig deeper into the specific components that make up a culture. The text highlights values, beliefs, norms, symbols, and language. What role do these components play in shaping a culture?
Those components, they're like the building blocks of culture.
Okay.
They provide a framework for how people think, how they behave, how they interact with each other.
Okay.
So values, those are like the broad principles that guide a culture's sense of what is good, what's desirable, and what's important.
So, for example, in American culture, there's a big emphasis on individualism, on achievement, and on freedom.
Exactly. And those values shape everything from our political system to our education system to our personal aspirations. Now, beliefs, on the other hand, are more specific ideas that people hold to be true.
Gotcha.
And these beliefs often stem from and kind of reinforce a culture's values.
Okay.
So, for instance, the belief in the American dream, the idea that anyone can achieve success through hard work and determination, that's closely tied to the value of individual achievement.
Ah, okay. So values are like the guiding principles, and beliefs are like the specific expressions of those principles.
That's a good way to think about it. Yeah.
Okay.
And then all of that is reflected in a culture's norms,
Right.
the rules and expectations that kind of guide behavior.
The text talks about formal and informal norms. What's the difference between those two?
Okay.
Yeah.
So formal norms are those that are explicitly stated, and they're often written down as laws
Okay.
or regulations. Think of things like traffic laws or rules against stealing.
Gotcha.
Now, informal norms, on the other hand, are the unspoken rules of behavior that we learned just by watching
Okay.
and through socialization.
So like the expectation that you stand in line at the grocery store, that you say please and thank you.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. Those are examples of informal norms that help keep order, keep things civil in social interactions. There's a sociologist named Harold Garfinkel.
Okay.
He did these really fascinating experiments, breaching experiments, he called them. He had his students intentionally violate informal norms, like standing too close to people or eating with their hands,
Oh, wow.
just to see how people would react.
That would make people uncomfortable, I'm sure.
Big time.
Yeah.
But it really highlighted how powerful those unspoken rules are in shaping our expectations and regulating our behavior.
Right, right. Now, within those categories of formal and informal norms,
Yes.
the text also talks about mores and folkways.
Right.
What's the distinction there?
So mores are norms that are considered essential to a society's core values and well-being. They usually have a really strong moral component. Violating them can have serious social consequences. Think of taboos like incest or murder.
Right,
Those are universally condemned and usually have really harsh penalties.
right. So folkways, on the other hand, are those everyday customs and
Yeah.
manners that might not have such a strong moral basis, but they're still important for smooth social interaction.
Exactly. So holding the door for someone.
Right.
Or saying bless you when someone sneezes. These things might seem like small gestures, but they contribute to a sense of politeness and shared understanding.
Right.
And the consequences for violating folkways are usually not as severe as violating mores.
Right.
You know, you might get some disapproval or maybe some awkwardness.
Like showing up to a formal event.
Exactly.
Drag casual clothes.
Yeah, you might get some weird looks.
Right. Right, exactly. So mores are those serious rules that are deeply ingrained in our values, while folkways are more like the social graces that kind of help us navigate those everyday interactions.
Precisely. And together, they form this complex web of expectations that shape how we behave
Yeah.
and maintain social order.
But all these norms and values don't just exist in a vacuum, right?
Right.
They need to be communicated and transmitted from one generation to the next.
Yes.
That's where symbols and language come in, right?
Absolutely.
So how do those play a role in culture?
So symbols are anything that stands for something else. It allows us to convey meaning beyond the literal object or action.
Okay.
And language, with all its words and grammar, that's really our primary tool for sharing and perpetuating culture.
Okay. So can you give us some examples of how symbols and language function in culture?
Sure. Think of a flag, right?
Mm.
I mean, it's just a piece of cloth. It's a physical object,
Right.
but it represents a whole set of ideas about national identity, patriotism, belonging.
Right.
The same with language, right?
Mm-hmm.
Words are symbols that represent concepts, objects, actions.
Mm-hmm.
They allow us to talk about abstract ideas, to share stories, and to pass knowledge down through generations.
The book actually mentions the Sepper-Whorf hypothesis.
Right.
Can you talk a little about that?
So that hypothesis suggests that language actually shapes the way we think.
Wow.
So the language we speak might actually influence how we see the world around us and how we categorize it. It's a complex and controversial topic,
Right.
but it highlights how deeply connected language is
Yeah.
to our thought processes and how it might even shape our understanding of reality.
That's fascinating. And beyond spoken language, we've also got nonverbal communication, right?
So absolutely.
Like body language, gestures, facial expressions, those things vary so much across cultures.
Oh, they do. They do. A gesture that's totally friendly in one culture
Mm.
could be incredibly offensive in another.
Yeah.
That's why it's so important to be aware of those differences.
Right.
And to approach communication with sensitivity and a willingness to learn.
Yeah. It sounds like navigating different cultural contexts requires a lot of awareness and flexibility.
It does, but it's also really rewarding.
Yeah.
It allows us to broaden our perspectives, to challenge our assumptions, and really appreciate the incredible diversity of human expression.
Yeah, I love that. So we've covered a lot of ground here. We've looked at the building blocks of culture, values, beliefs, norms, symbols, and language.
Hmm.
But cultures aren't like monolithic, right?
You're right.
The text discusses this idea of cultural diversity, how that manifests within societies.
Right. So even within a single society, you're going to find all sorts of cultural expressions. You've got your subcultures, your countercultures,
Right.
and each of them contribute to this really rich and complex tapestry of culture.
So what exactly are subcultures and countercultures?
Okay, so subcultures are groups within a larger society
Okay.
that share a distinct set of values, beliefs, and practices. They might have their own unique style of dress, certain music preferences, or even their own ways of interacting with each other.
Okay. So like biker culture would be an example.
Yeah, biker culture, the goth scene, even those diehard fans of a specific band or a TV show, they all form subcultures.
Gotcha. So they're part of the larger society, but they've got their own distinct cultural identity.
Exactly.
Okay. And countercultures are a little bit more rebellious, I guess.
Yeah, you could say that. They actively reject or challenge those dominant values and norms
Okay.
of the larger society.
So like the punk rock movement
Yeah.
of the 1970s or the hippie counterculture of the 1960s.
Exactly. Those are classic examples of countercultures, challenging the mainstream, seeking to create these alternative ways of living and thinking.
Right. So understanding these different cultural expressions within a society, that can really give us a more nuanced view
It
of
does.
how culture works.
Yeah, it reminds us that culture isn't this monolithic thing. It's this dynamic and multifaceted tapestry of beliefs and practices and identities.
Okay, so we've explored all the components of culture, values, norms, symbols, language. We've touched on that diversity of cultural expressions within societies, from subcultures to countercultures. Now, I'm curious about how sociologists make sense of all this complexity. The book mentions 3 major theoretical perspectives on culture: functionalism, conflict theory, and symbolic interactionism.
Right.
Can you walk us through those? Like, how do these perspectives differ in their approaches to understanding culture?
Okay, so those 3 perspectives offer kind of different lenses
Okay.
through which to view and analyze culture. So let's start with functionalism.
All right.
Functionalism emphasizes culture's role in maintaining social order and stability.
Okay.
It sees culture as a system with interconnected parts that all work together to meet the needs of society.
So from a functionalist point of view, those shared values and norms that we talked about earlier, those are essential
Oh, yeah?
for keeping society running smoothly.
Exactly. They provide that framework for cooperation, for predictability, and they ensure that people can live and work together, relatively harmoniously.
Okay, so like the education system, for example.
Yeah.
From a functionalist perspective, education serves to transmit knowledge, skills, prepare individuals for their roles in society, and it reinforces those social norms and values.
Exactly. And that helps maintain social order by creating this shared understanding of how things work.
Right.
And what's expected of individuals.
Okay, now conflict theory takes a different approach, right? It focuses more on the power dynamics within a culture.
It does, yeah.
And how those can lead to inequality and conflict.
Right. So conflict theorists argue that culture isn't always this unifying force, right?
Right.
They see it as this site of struggle where different groups are competing for power, for resources. They might say that the dominant culture, which is the values, beliefs, and practices of the most powerful groups,
Right.
often serves to just reinforce their own privilege and marginalize those who are different.
So, for example, conflict theorists might look at the media and see how it often portrays certain groups in negative or stereotypical ways, and that reinforces existing power structures and inequalities.
Or they might look at the legal system
Right.
and see how it disproportionately punishes people who are already disadvantaged.
Right.
And it often protects the interests of the wealthy and powerful.
Okay. Now, what about symbolic interactionism? How does that perspective view culture?
So symbolic interactionism, that takes a more micro-level approach. It focuses on how individuals create meaning and how they interpret meaning through their interactions with other people. It sees culture as something that's constantly being negotiated and reshaped through these everyday encounters.
Right.
So it's less about those big abstract systems of values and norms and more about how people actually live and experience those values and norms in their daily lives.
So it's about how people use language to create shared meaning, how they interpret each other's actions, and how those interpretations can lead to misunderstandings or even conflict.
Exactly.
Yeah.
For example, symbolic interactionists might be interested in studying how people from different cultures use nonverbal communication.
Right.
You know, things like eye contact or personal space, and how those differences can lead to those awkward interactions.
Right. Right. It's kind of like that example we started with, right? How even simple greetings can be misinterpreted across cultures because of those subtle differences in meaning.
It highlights how even those seemingly small interactions can be really loaded with cultural significance.
Yeah, that's a great point. So we've got these three theoretical lenses: functionalism, conflict theory, and symbolic interactionism, each offering a different way of understanding culture. But they're not mutually exclusive, are they?
No, not at all.
Okay.
In fact, they can be quite complementary.
Okay.
You can actually use all three of these perspectives to gain a more well-rounded understanding of how culture works.
So we can see how culture functions to create that social cohesion while acknowledging the power dynamics that can shape cultural norms and create those inequalities. And at the same time, we can zoom in on those everyday interactions to see how people are actively constructing and negotiating meaning.
Exactly. It's all about using these different tools to analyze and interpret that really complex tapestry of culture.
I feel like we've already covered so much ground, and we're just getting started. This deep dive is proving to be quite an adventure.
It is, yeah. But that's the thing about exploring culture. It's kind of a journey with no real endpoint.
Right.
There's always more to learn and question and discover.
Yeah. It really is. And it's amazing how these different perspectives, can shed light on the same cultural phenomenon. It's like looking at a painting from different angles.
That's a good way to think about it, yeah.
Each perspective kind of reveals something new and interesting. Speaking of different perspectives, the book also mentions these distinctions within culture itself. High culture, low culture, and popular culture. What are those all about?
Okay, so those categories, they're all about how we classify different forms of cultural expression and experience. So high culture, that's usually associated with the elite.
Okay.
Think classical music, opera, fine art, literature.
Okay, so it's kind of like the fancy stuff that's seen as sophisticated, intellectually stimulating.
Right, and it's often associated with prestige and exclusivity.
Gotcha.
Then you have low culture, which is typically associated with the working class or less educated segments of society.
So that would be like reality TV, tabloid magazines, maybe certain genres of music that aren't considered, highbrow.
Right, exactly. And then you've got popular culture, which kind of sits in between those two.
Okay.
It's the mainstream culture that's accessible to pretty much everyone. And it's often driven by commercial interests.
So like blockbuster movies, pop music, those viral trends that everyone's talking about.
Exactly. And popular culture is always changing, and it reflects the tastes and preferences of a wide range of people.
Yeah, but it's interesting, though, how those lines between high culture and popular culture can blur over time. Like, Shakespeare's plays were once considered popular entertainment,
That's true.
but now they're seen as high culture.
Right. So it's not that those categories are fixed.
Right.
They can shift as those cultural values and tastes change over time.
And within those broader categories, we also have those subcultures and countercultures, right?
Yeah, we do.
What sets them apart?
So subcultures, those are smaller groups within a larger culture that share a specific set of values, norms, and practices that kind of set them apart.
So, like, biker culture.
Yeah.
Or the goth scene. Or even like those dedicated fans of a specific band or TV show.
Right. So they are their own little worlds within the larger world.
Exactly. And subcultures often give a sense of belonging and identity to their members, but they still exist within that framework of the larger culture.
Okay, so they're not totally separate.
Right.
What about countercultures? They tend to be a bit more rebellious, right?
Yeah, they tend to be. So countercultures, they really actively reject or challenge those dominant values and norms of the larger society.
So like the hippie movement of the 1960s or the punk rock scene or any groups that are really advocating for radical social or political change.
Exactly. Those are all great examples. Countercultures, they often pop up in response to what they see as problems or injustices in that main dominant culture.
Okay.
And they're trying to create alternative ways of living and thinking.
So we have this whole spectrum of cultural expression from the very elite to the mainstream to those who are pushing back against the grain.
Yes.
It seems like each one adds to this richness and diversity of human experience. Definitely.
But, cultures aren't static, are they? They change over time.
That's an important point, yeah. Cultural change is always happening.
And it's driven by so many different factors, right? We talked about innovation, diffusion, those internal dynamics like shifting values and power struggles.
Right, it's a mix of things.
And in today's world, with globalization, it seems like the pace of change is just accelerating.
It is, yeah. It's incredible how interconnected we are now.
Right.
That flow of information, ideas, people across borders, cultures are influencing each other more than ever before.
Which brings up some interesting questions like, are we losing unique cultural identities? Is everything becoming kind of homogenized?
Yeah, there are definitely concerns about that. Anthropologists and sociologists, they're really looking into those dynamics.
Yeah.
But globalization is a complex thing. It's not always a one-way street. It can lead to the spread of some of those more dominant cultural forms, but it also creates opportunities for cultural exchange, for hybridity, even a resurgence of local traditions.
Okay, so it's not just a simple case of global culture replacing all local cultures.
No, it's a lot more nuanced than that.
Yeah.
Think about the popularity of world music or ethnic cuisines. These are great examples of how local cultural expressions can gain global appeal.
Right.
And they can even influence mainstream culture in interesting ways.
Yeah. It's like globalization can be a force for both homogenization and diversification.
Exactly. It all depends on how different cultures interact and adapt to this increasingly interconnected world.
It's a lot to wrap our heads around. So we've been talking about how innovation and diffusion drive cultural change, the complexities of globalization, and its impact on local cultures. But cultures don't just change from outside forces, right? There are also those internal forces that shape how cultures evolve.
Right.
The book talked about this concept of cultural lag. Can you explain that a little more?
Sure. So cultural lag, that's the gap that can pop up between the material culture and the non-material culture.
Okay.
So when the technology or other material aspects of a culture change really quickly, our values, our beliefs, our norms, they might take a while to catch up.
How you give an example?
Think about the development of self-driving cars.
Okay.
The technology is advancing at an incredible pace, but our legal systems,
Right.
our ethical norms, even our comfort level, psychologically, with giving control to a machine, those things are lagging behind.
Right, so we're still figuring out the rules of the road
Exactly.
for self-driving cars, even though the technology is already here.
Exactly. And that gap, that's cultural lag. And it can create tension and challenges as societies try to adapt to these rapid changes.
Yeah, it makes sense. It's like the material culture is speeding ahead and the non-material culture is trying to keep up.
Exactly.
So it's not always a smooth transition.
It isn't.
But understanding that concept can help us maybe anticipate and navigate those potential bumps as cultures adjust to new technologies and ideas.
It can, definitely.
Okay, so we've explored all sorts of factors that drive cultural change. innovation, diffusion, globalization, those internal dynamics like cultural lag. But I'm curious, can you give us some concrete examples of cultures that have gone through really significant transformations?
Sure. One really interesting example is China.
Okay.
Over the past few decades, with rapid economic growth and urbanization, you've seen this clash between traditional values and practices, and then these new ideas and lifestyles that come with modernization and global capitalism.
So it's like traditional Chinese culture trying to coexist with globalization and modernization.
In a way, yeah. It's a complex process, and it has both positive and negative aspects, right?
Yeah.
On one hand, China has seen incredible economic progress. There's a rising middle class, there are greater opportunities, improved living standards for many people. But this rapid change has also led to social and cultural tensions,
Yeah.
as people try to figure out their identity,
Right.
deal with inequality, and sometimes experience a sense of loss for traditional ways of life.
Yeah, it's a reminder that cultural change isn't always straightforward or easy.
It isn't, though.
It often involves those trade-offs and tensions between different values and ways of life.
And understanding those complexities is really important when we're looking at cultural transformations that are happening all over the world.
So China is a great example. Any other compelling examples of cultural change come to mind?
Yeah, I think the Middle East is another interesting case. In recent years, there have been some cultural shifts in many parts of the region.
Okay.
Social media and other digital technologies, they've really empowered young people. They're getting access to information and ideas from all over the world. They're connecting with others who share their interests and their aspirations.
Right. So it's like technology is driving a cultural shift in a region that has often been, known for traditional values and social structures.
Yeah, I'd say so. The internet and social media, they've created spaces for open dialogue, for debate, for diverse perspectives to be shared. And this challenges those traditional hierarchies and norms.
Right.
So it's led to some opportunities and also some challenges as societies grapple with things like freedom of expression, censorship,
Yeah.
and the role of technology in shaping those cultural values.
It's fascinating to see how technology can be both like a tool for preserving culture, but also this catalyst for change.
Absolutely. And how it plays out depends on how it's used and the context in which it's implemented.
Yeah.
Understanding these dynamics is essential as we move forward, as technology and culture continue to evolve together.
So we've explored some specific examples of cultural change, China's modernization, the impact of technology in the Middle East. It's clear that cultures are dynamic and they're shaped by this complex interplay of internal and external forces.
Right.
But I'm curious to kind of dig deeper into how those changes affect us on an individual level. Like, how does cultural change impact our sense of who we are, our identity, our sense of belonging?
That's a really good question. Cultural change, it could be a very personal experience,
Yeah.
often means grappling with shifting values and beliefs and sometimes even ways of life.
Right.
It can create uncertainty, maybe some confusion, even a sense of loss as individuals navigate this tension between tradition and modernity.
It makes me think of people who migrate to new countries. They're trying to adapt to this new culture, but also hold on to their own heritage.
That's a perfect example. Immigrants often find themselves in this position where they're straddling two cultures,
Yeah.
trying to navigate both their home culture and the new one they're integrating into.
All right.
It can be really challenging, but also a very enriching experience. It can lead to a deeper understanding of both cultures
Yeah.
and maybe a more nuanced sense of their own identity.
Yeah, it sounds like cultural change can be stressful, but it can also lead to personal growth.
Definitely. It might shake up our sense of self, but it can open us up to new possibilities and perspectives.
Okay, so we've explored how cultural change affects our identities, those challenges of navigating multiple cultural contexts. But cultures aren't just about individuals, right? They're also about collective action, social movements.
Yes.
How does cultural change relate to those efforts to, say, promote social justice
Right.
or address issues of inequality?
Well, cultural change is often at the heart of movements that are trying to challenge existing power structures, promote equality, and create a more just and equitable society. Think about the civil rights movement in the U.S.
Right.
or the feminist movement, even the LGBTQ plus rights movement.
Yeah.
All these movements have involved challenging those dominant cultural norms and values,
Right.
pushing for more inclusivity, recognition,
Right.
advocating for a fair distribution of power and resources.
So it's like these movements are trying to rewrite the cultural script that kind of guides our understanding of who we are and how we relate to each other.
Yeah, that's a really good way to put it. Cultural change, it's often a slow process. It happens gradually.
Right.
But these movements show us the power of collective action to challenge the way things are and push for a better world. They remind us that culture isn't just something that happens to us.
Right.
It's something we can actively shape and change.
It's inspiring to think about how cultural change can really be a force for positive transformation.
It is, and understanding how culture and these social justice movements are intertwined can help us become better advocates for that change.
Yeah, and create a world that reflects our values of equality and fairness and inclusion.
Exactly.
Okay, so in this deep dive, we've gone through a lot. We've explored so many dimensions of culture, the basic components, the dynamics of cultural change. But I feel like we've just scratched the surface.
Yeah, there's always more to learn, right?
Before we wrap up, I'd love to hear your thoughts on how technology is shaping and reshaping culture today.
Yeah.
You know, we touched on smartphones, but there are so many other technological advancements that are really influencing our values and our behaviors.
Absolutely. Technology is constantly influencing culture in major ways.
Yeah.
Social media, AI, virtual reality, biotechnology. These things raise so many questions about who we are,
Right.
how we interact, what it means to be human in the 21st century.
It really does feel like we're living through a time of rapid change.
We are, yeah.
Yeah.
It can be exciting, but also a little overwhelming.
It is. But it's also a fascinating time to be alive. We have the chance to witness these changes, to be part of shaping the future of culture.
That's right.
So it's not just about observing what's happening, it's about actively participating in it.
Exactly. That willingness to learn and adapt that's going to be so important for navigating all these changes in the digital age.
I can't wait to dive into those topics more, but for now, I think we've given our listener a lot to think about.
We have. I think we've laid a solid foundation for understanding culture and all its complexities.
It's amazing, isn't it? I feel like my mind is blown wide open after this deep dive. It's like I'm seeing culture everywhere. In how people dress, the music they listen to, their little rituals, even the way they use technology.
I know, right? That's what I love about studying culture. Once you really start to pay attention, you see it everywhere. It's amazing.
And it's not just about seeing it. It's about understanding how all of this shapes us. It shapes our values, our beliefs, even just how we see the world around us.
Absolutely. Culture is like this lens, this invisible lens that shapes our entire reality.
Okay, so before we wrap things up, there's one more question I just have to ask. We've talked a lot about how culture shapes us, but how much do we shape culture?
Wow, that's a great question. It really gets to the heart of it, how dynamic culture really is.
Yeah.
You know, it's not this set-in-stone thing. It's always being created, recreated through our actions, our choices, the way we interact with other people.
So we're not just stuck with the culture we're born into. We can actually play a part in changing it.
Exactly. Think about it. Every time we challenge a stereotype, embrace a new idea, connect with someone from a different background, we're changing the conversation.
That's pretty powerful when you think about it. We're not just products of our culture, we're also shaping it, changing it.
That's right. And that's both a responsibility and a really amazing opportunity. It means we can influence the culture for the next generation.
So what advice would you give to someone who's maybe feeling a little overwhelmed by all this talk of cultural change? Where do they even begin to make sense of it all?
I think the best place to start is to look inward. Pay attention to your own experiences with culture. What values and beliefs have shaped you? Where did they come from? How have they changed over time?
It's like becoming more aware of your own cultural background, right?
Exactly. And once you understand your own lens, you can start to see the world from other people's perspectives. It makes those cross-cultural conversations much richer and more meaningful.
It's like we need to be anthropologists of our own lives before we can truly understand the larger cultural landscape.
That's a great way to put it. And don't forget, this is a lifelong journey. Culture keeps evolving, and we need to keep learning and adapting with it.
This deep dive has definitely given me a lot to think about. It's like I've unlocked this whole new level of understanding about culture. It's fascinating.
That's awesome to hear. It's been a pleasure exploring these ideas with you.
Likewise, I'm sure our listener is feeling equally inspired to learn more. Thanks for joining us on this incredible journey into the world of culture. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep the conversation going.